Spoilers ahead for Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. If you're a fan of Spider-Man, you've probably heard of the SpiderVerse, which started as a 90s cartoon event, spun off into a video game, inspired the basis of a comic event, which spun off to two many comic events, which inspired the basis of the most successful Spider-Man movie of all time, and of course looped back around to animation with 2018's Into the Spider-Verse and its sequels, Across the Spider-Verse and the yet-to-be-released Beyond the Spider-Verse. These Spider-Verse events typically bring in some of the most popular variations of Spider-Man for the audience to laugh and point at and have a good time. Chief among these is good old Peter Parker, everyone's favorite Miles Morales, the ever-loony Spider-Ham, famed Nazi puncher Spider-Man Noir, famed Nazi puncher Spider-Punk, the one with the most spider DNA, Spider-Man 2099, and my personal favorite, Spider-Gwen. Spider-Gwen is the result of a very simple what-if. What if we took one of comics' most famous examples of fridging and gave her the superpowers instead? What results is a very interesting case where the fridging is reversed, and for the first time in decades, Gwen Stacy is treated with respect in a comic book. But you're not here today to hear me talk about the history of fridging or Spider-Gwen. You're here because I put a thumbnail on this video that made you confused and you want to know whether I agree or disagree with you because it's validating to share the same opinion as strangers on the internet. So, is Gwen Stacy trans in Across the Spider-Verse? Maybe? It's hard to give anything other than vague non-answers because of a phenomenon known as queer coding. If you're any of these letters or the plus sign at the end, you probably know what queer coding is, but for video padding's sake, queer coding is a style of characterization where a character is given traits or story beats typically associated with LGBT stereotypes or storytelling. This isn't an inherently bad phenomenon, having been used to sidestep certain censors in recent years to display a character's queerness without outright stating it, but the use of queer coding also has a long history of negative depictions of the gays in media. Some famous examples of queer coding are Ursula from The Little Mermaid, or LeFou from Beauty and the Beast, or actually a lot of Disney villains. Queer coding rose to prominence in the era of the Haze Code. For those that don't know, the Haze Code was a set of guidelines placed on Hollywood by Hollywood in an attempt to avoid government intervention, a role that the MPAA would later take. The guidelines were heavily restrictive and based on 1930s moral puritanism, which inspired filmmakers who hated it to find ways to get around it without breaking it. Although the Haze Code was eventually thrown into the garbage thanks to films like Some Like It Hot, moral puritanism still is a mainstay in Hollywood to this day. Thus, queer coding became a mainstay, either to show support for LGBT communities or to show how Disney hated gay people until they spent enough money to print rainbows on everything. And Across the Spider-Verse, Gwen isn't queer-coded in the overtly stereotyped traits way, but her narrative is queer-coded and can be seen as allegorical of LGBT coming out stories. To strip it down to its bare beats, Gwen is hiding a secret about her identity from her father. Gwen's father harbors resentment towards this identity. Gwen reveals this identity to her father in a moment of emotional vulnerability. Gwen's father doesn't take this revelation well. Gwen retreats to a safe space with more people like her that are willing to support her. Gwen returns home after months expecting her father to be unsupportive. Gwen's father misses his daughter and accepts her in his own moment of emotional vulnerability. If you replace the word Spider-Woman with any LGBT identity, no one would bat an eye other than the bit where her father tries to arrest her. And now, this isn't the first time a Spidey has dealt with their identity as Spider-Man or Spider-Woman or a collective of spiders in a suit, but I think it's important to note that those struggles typically boil down to a struggle with something other than acceptance. In many iterations, including the first Spider-Verse film, Aunt May is nothing but supportive of Peter as Spider-Man, and MJ spent decades in an active support role for Peter as Spider-Man in the comics. Whenever most Spider people want to quit being Spider-Man, it's because they don't want to deal with the responsibility. Take Spectacular Spider-Man, for instance. From the get-go, Peter struggles with the conflict of his Spider-Man identity and his civilian identity. Following the fiasco with Kirk Connors turning into the Lizard, he steals a vial of gene cleanser that would erase his powers should he consume it. His identity as Spider-Man caused conflict and strife for his life as Peter Parker when Eddie Brock points out he took the pictures of the Lizard incident. So why doesn't he drink the gene cleanser? His life would be so much simpler if he wasn't Spider-Man, and he even acknowledges that. What stops him is the reminder of a somber lesson he learned. With great power comes great responsibility. He has the identity struggle because of that great responsibility and how it's gotten in the way of his personal life, not because he wants anyone to accept his dual identity as Spider-Man. Changing that struggle from responsibility to acceptance is what makes Spider-Verse a queer narrative. Gay people don't struggle with using their gayness responsibly unless they're fighting the urge to binge watch the latest season of Harley Quinn instead of going to work. An unfortunate amount of the LGBT community does, however, face a heartbreaking amount of rejection from friends and family that should love them unconditionally. I think it's important to note that Gwen doesn't try to abandon being Spider-Woman, she tries to abandon the family that won't accept her as Spider-Woman, and she grows wary of the idea that any non-Spidey could accept the superhero double identity. Unfortunately, there's just no way to tell whether the filmmakers intended for Gwen to be representative of one specific identity, or whether it was even intentional at all. But we can look at why the discourse is specifically about whether or not Gwen is supposed to be trans. The Spider-Verse franchise is famous for its intricate details in animation. In the first movie, even the frame rate that characters moved at was part of the storytelling. So when we see blending colors of blue, pink, and white during Gwen's emotional reconciliation with her father, it kinda tips the scales towards her being a trans allegory. But I do also have to point out that those are the colors of her costume, and they also appear in this beautifully animated shot where she first reveals her identity to her father. On the other hand, though, she does have a pride flag in her room. It's easy to understand why people would jump to Gwen being trans being canon when taking into account the history of queer coding in general. It's especially easy to understand that queer coding may have been used in her story when you realize Sony has their own code they have to follow when depicting Spider-Man characters. This is a list of all mandatory Spider-Man characteristics that Sony has to follow when depicting Spider-Man in their movies. It leaked in the big Sony email hack a few years back. A side note, according to these guidelines, Peter Parker can sell heroin to kids and kill people while under the influence of the symbiote, but he's not allowed to say the F word. This list of traits applies not only to Peter Parker, but to all variations of Spider-Man, including Spider-Gwen. That last bullet point on the list, quote, not a homosexual, parentheses, unless Marvel has portrayed that alter ego as a homosexual. And while being gay and being trans aren't mutually exclusive, the intent behind that is pretty clear. In short, Gwen can't be trans, if for nothing else due to contract reasons. But you can still hold her up as a trans icon if you really want to. It's harmless and, like, come on. Have you seen her haircut? Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate if you stuck around and watched some of my other videos, like this one right here. I don't know what it is, but YouTube thinks it's the best one for you. Also, I'm working on a big project about video game movies, which is why this one might have felt a little rushed. I would really appreciate it if you subscribed to stick around for that one. Ciao!